Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. And on behalf of my colleagues, Joe Cravens and Jason Grissom, we bring warm welcome from Peabody College in Nashville, Tennessee. And we are so excited about this collaboration and this partnership because we know the crises and the challenges and the opportunities in leadership are definitely global. So I'd like you to consider 3 questions. Imagine you yourself or a highly effective teacher who is interested in moving into leadership. What steps would you or your school system take to support this transition? Or has anyone here, your leaders, your teachers, your systems leaders, has anyone here been part of a successful leadership transition that was facilitated by your school or your school system? What made that transition successful? Or how do current policies, if you're at the system level or at the ministry level, how do current policies and practices in your context support or hinder the development of school leadership, including identifying future leaders, supporting their development before they enter the position? Take a minute and think about those questions. If we were in a seminar, I'd have you talk to your neighbor, pair, share, but maybe this afternoon you'll have an opportunity to talk about these questions. So I think by the nature of the questions, you can see what I'm going to talk today about this morning. Although you will hear a lot today from my colleagues about what effective leaders do and what are the actions they can take to support and develop teachers, perhaps one area of school leadership that we don't think enough about is called succession planning. And in the United States, there is quite a widespread movement of succession planning in educational systems that we call leadership pipelines or principal pipelines. So I'm going to talk to you today about leadership pipelines. So when we think about succession planning, what we mean is the early development and identification of potential leaders, expanding the pool of qualified leaders, reducing the risks of leadership transitions, ensuring that schools and systems can maintain continuity and momentum. And in fact, we know from the evidence base that leadership transitions, when principals leave their schools, it can have very negative impact on student achievement and teacher retention. So how do we plan for those events? This is called a proactive approach to talent management. Why is this important? We know from some of the best companies across the world that those companies that have a productive and positive talent management system, they are known for attracting the most amazing workers and leaders to their organization. Young people want to work there because they know they have a future. They know they will be invested in. They know they can move forward. They know they will be supported. And they know they are working in a positive environment. So in my time today, I'm going to describe what are leadership pipelines. Now, this is in the US, and so we want to have the opportunity to think about what are the implications for different contexts, and we'll discuss that towards the end. So what are leadership pipelines? What are pipeline activities, initiatives, and programs? What is the evidence base on leadership pipelines? And can they be scaled up? In other words, in the United States, have we been successful to implement this approach and initiative beyond the initial districts and schools where they were tried out and developed? And then lastly, as I said, I hope we can share some discussion and recommendations about what were the factors that supported districts that were better able to implement pipelines, and how might we think together about an approach to succession planning and leadership pipelines that fit your context, your schools, and your culture. So why do I think succession planning and leadership pipelines are so important now, today, given where we are in the education global world? Schools across the world are facing numerous threats. Again, many of these are in the US, but many of them I have had the experience to understand and observe in other countries. But the crises also provides opportunities, and I think leadership pipelines or succession planning are one way to consider meeting the challenges. So we know that post the pandemic, there are widespread retirements and vacancies in the school leadership position. I don't know if this is the case in your country as much as it's the case in our country, but many schools have vacancies for school principals, or they have very few candidates interested or willing to be moved when there is an opening. There's also what we call churn in the system, a lot of turnover, principals moving from one school to another school to fill those vacancies. There is declining interest in the profession of education. If we do not have a large number of teachers moving into the profession, then ultimately that pathway, that pipeline becomes depleted, and therefore we don't have enough interest in moving into the principalship. We face teacher shortages in the United States, and on average, there is declining enrollment in education programs in the United States, specifically in teacher preparation and teacher education programs. All of these threats lead to a crisis of where and how we will have the next generation of school leaders. At the same time, these challenges actually provide us with opportunities to think anew, to rethink what is the profession of education and what is the future for those young people who want to make a difference in society. So as there are vacancies and retirements, we have the opportunity to actually recruit in a whole new generation of school leaders. Perhaps this is the time to rethink what leaders need to know and be able to do, and what are the dispositions. You know, one of the challenges in research is that we are researching what is now or what has occurred in the past. But if we're thinking about the future and planning the profession, planning for who will be the next generation of school leaders, it gives us the opportunity to also ask ourselves, what should the leaders of the future know? What are the competencies? We also can include new voices into those conversations. Where is the student voice in thinking about what's an effective principal? Where are our communities that speak different languages, that are newcomers? We call them newcomers, new immigrants that are sending their children to our schools. How do we include these voices and networks into the conversations about our future leadership. And lastly, we know we have so many new opportunities for learning and teaching. Although I'm standing here lecturing, we do know that there are more effective and more engaging approaches to teaching and learning. And as we think about preparing the next generation, we can also consider new ways of learning. So in the United States, just to make my point clear, why succession planning is actually so high on the policy agenda is if pre-pandemic superintendents, so superintendents are the chief officer of our school districts that organize education systems in the United States. Think about the Minister of Education for a small city or a town or a locale. So superintendents reported before the pandemic, about 3% of principals resigned or retired. And in 2021, they reported 6%. And in 21-22, they actually reported 16% of principals in their locale are retiring, have retired, or have left their systems. That's a huge number trying to tell us something. Something is not working. At the same time, we have this fact of rapid turnover and vacancies in the principalship in the United States. We also see the growth of the assistant principal across the United States. So in the past 25 years, we see a very large increase of the assistant principal across all types of schools, especially in elementary schools. So here's a fact trying to tell us something. We have many, many more assistant principals, but we don't have enough principals. So what is happening in the transition from assistant principals to principals? And where are all the assistant principals going? Or why are they choosing to stay in their profession, in that role? And we call this the leaky pipeline. Along the pathway from teaching to the principalship, there are many leaks. And we do not have enough principals in the United States. So why have districts turned to succession planning as a solution to effective leadership? So the goal is to have a highly effective principal ready to move into the role, we say on day one. Now, I'm not saying anything negative about continuous professional development, CPD. I'm not saying anything negative about learning networks and on-the-job training. I'm not saying anything negative about learning communities, but it's not enough to start that work when a person moves into the role. And clearly, given the amount of professional development on the job that we have to do, we could ask whether our pre-role, what we call pre-service preparation, is actually sufficient. So one district, I think, defined the need for succession planning this way. Why do they submit to a robust succession planning approach? And this is from a very large urban school district. Turnover in districts, especially turnover of schools and district leaders, can negatively impact student outcomes. Succession planning requires identifying talent who can step into critical roles immediately and ensuring that they have the institutional knowledge and development necessary to do so efficiently and effectively. Without careful planning for transitions, districts fall into the trap of simply replacing key staff members without the essential overlap and mentoring necessary to ensure more immediate efficacy, success. In other words, if you wait to place a person when the opening occurs, there are chances that that person will not be successful. I mentioned that I think now is the time to consider leadership pipelines and succession planning because of some challenges and new areas we as a field are facing. Of course, the most obvious is technology and AI, but not only AI, new technologies in the classroom. I think the pandemic taught us that perhaps there's a different skill set that principals need in terms of resilience in times of crisis. And unfortunately, the world is facing many crises. The new knowledge and skills that youth bring to school is very different than generations past. And this creates huge new expectations on school leaders' shoulders. Many of you are carrying the weight of those expectations. So I hope I've defined for you what succession planning and principal pipelines are. And I hope I've convinced you that this is an approach to meeting the needs of our schools and our school systems. So now I'm going to define for you an intervention or an approach to succession planning and principal pipelines that was developed in the United States alongside the Wallace Foundation, which is one of our large foundations focusing on school leadership and educational leadership in the United States. So principal pipelines, as I said, are a systematic approach to succession planning, and they are a linear approach to identifying future leaders already when a person steps into the school district, and ongoing support and a career ladder through future positions past school leadership. So it is a whole system of leadership development from teaching to leader to system leader. Now, if you remember one thing about my talk, this is probably the thing. So you may be sitting here saying, okay, I get it. I know it's important. So what do we do? So leadership pipelines is a model developed with 7, we call them domains. If we think about implementation, these 7 domains in the United States are the core components of principal pipeline change initiative. It doesn't mean these are the right core components for your system. They're the ones that worked for our system. So I'm going to discuss these one at a time. These are quite linear in order, but I want to stress that the 7 domains are a cohesive system. And when I get to the evidence, one of the things the research shows is that it's not one domain or the other that seem to make an impact, but the 7 together as a system. The second thing I'll say is I don't know where else in the world there is a comprehensive system of pipelines. But I looked. So I looked for the literature in other countries. Of course, when in doubt, I went to ChatGPT and I said, what are the leadership pipelines, principal pipelines, succession planning? I used many different words around the world, including Chile. And what I found were instances of one domain. Many countries, of course, have leadership academies. Many countries have amazing, robust professional development. Many countries have, almost all countries have, a type of university preparation. But what I could not find, and I would be very interested in learning from your experience, is whether There are other places that have what we call a cohesive, comprehensive approach. And I'm going to show you some examples of how these domains come together in a pipeline. So the first domain is leader standards. So where the school districts who implemented pipeline started was in defining what leaders need to know and be able to do. What is the framework of leadership? But the thing is there's not one framework. In other words, what an assistant principal or a teacher leader or a department chair or a principal or a system leader or a middle leader needs to be able to do. And also remember, we want to think about the future, not only what we have been doing. So it's differentiated standards for positions that are moving along the pipeline. If I'm an instructional coach, if I'm the lead of a learning community, what are the skills, the knowledge, the dispositions, and how does that come into play for the pipeline? So that's where the district started, defining where we want to go and what's the progression for different positions. Then we have domain 2, which is to think holistically about preparation. Up until now, we tend to have one preparation program, and they're for principals. So in the United States, leaders, teachers who are interested in leader go to a pre-service principal preparation program. They get a license to become a principal, but they don't go into the principalship for many years because they're going to be an assistant principal first or a teacher leader. And so they're not being prepared for the roles that they're going to do. And then maybe when they go to the principalship, they're going in a different school, a different community, have different learning requirements, so there's a mismatch. But I want to focus on processes that encourage staff to become school leaders. I want to ask you, what do you do in your systems to develop the interest and the excitement of moving into differentiated learning leadership positions early on, early enough? Domain 3, very important. How do we, in the districts, how did they select and hire and place individuals into positions? What's the evidence base, the process by which school districts are using data and making these decisions? So you can begin to see that one domain is built on the other. They don't happen in isolation. Then as leaders are placed into positions, whether it be teacher leadership, assistant principal, principal, there is on-the-job support and evaluation, but the evaluation is tied to the roles and to the goals of the work. Again, in our system, most leaders, assistant principals and principals are evaluated in the same evaluation system. So it's tied to the principal system, but yet assistant principals, deans of students, they are not doing that job. So the evaluation support is not helpful. So in districts that implement pipelines, alignment is very key. We have a new position that is part of the pipeline, which is called principal supervisors. Principal supervisors are not inspectors. They are trained to support and develop leaders on the job in their schools, and they are the leads of professional learning communities. All the system can work if there is a good leader tracking system or data system. So these are dashboards that human resource departments develop within the district that articulate the individuals in the district, their aspirations, their leadership positions, their informal leadership positions, their training, their evaluation, so that when I'm thinking about who to move in what position, it's not just based on me volunteering, but it's based on a systematic review of what are the talents, aspirations, and interests of the individuals in my system. And then lastly, the districts have developed a whole system, a unit to support the pipeline work. And I'll come to this in the end because it's very important. But one of the most important positions is the Director of Leadership Pipelines, with authority and responsibility to consider all the domains together. So this is what we have implemented across the United States when we say a leadership pipeline. And this is what it looks like, hence the pipeline, when you think about a person starting with leader standards, preparation, hiring, evaluation and support, a tracking system, and supervision, all focusing on appointing leaders in schools. Now I'm going to show you an example from one of the districts. So we are following leadership pipelines in my research with a large team in the United States at Peabody. And one of our districts, sorry, the slide got a little over to the side, but Greenville School District is a school district in South Carolina. It's, we would say, quite a large district. There are about 80,000 students. It's a very diverse district, and also it has about 57% of the students who are facing poverty and disadvantage. There are 97 schools in this district, so one superintendent is responsible for the 97 schools, so it's very large and very complex. So they have implemented a leadership pipeline approach as one of their core improvement strategies. They implemented the pipeline to ensure that they had every school benefits from the leadership that sustains commitment to common goals and increases the future opportunity of all their students. So this is an example of their pipeline in practice. So this is what they are doing across the span. You can see how complex it is and how many components it has. But what is unique here is that every role has a touchstone or a touch point into leadership development. They're not starting or considering the school leader, but everything that comes before. And they have different expectations and different considerations for the various steps along the pipeline. So for example, a teacher leader is considered a leader in their class. And the core competencies for the teacher leader are to initiate, communicate, lead team projects. And how do they develop that leadership in the school system? They train them to be mentors and peer evaluators. So in many school districts, the teacher observation system is not only done by the principal or the vice principal, but by a peer evaluator. So by going into classrooms and formally evaluating and then providing feedback to teachers, that's a type of leadership development. So imagine when that teacher becomes a leader, how much experience they will have on giving feedback and creating goal setting with teachers. They have a master teacher academy. They have a lead educator academy where some of the teachers are leading the professional development communities. So that's step one in the classroom. Then they have leader of teachers, where teachers become instructional coaches. And you can see here once again that they have particular goals, which is becoming more expert in pedagogy and learning how to coach and mentor others. And this just doesn't happen, right? So they have academies and learning communities and institutes for teachers who are becoming instructional coaches or leaders of teachers. So there's leadership developing happening at each step along the system. And then you have the administrator, or what we call the assistant principal. And this focuses on leading people and leading change beyond the core functions of evaluating teachers, mentoring teachers, coaching teachers into other areas. So again, there is an assistant principal academy, which focuses very much on the role of instructional leadership, and a formal aspiring principal institute. And then lastly, they have the school leader, which is the principal step, with a principal induction program. In many cases, candidates are spending a full year in residency, like medical school, to work alongside a principal. And then lastly, where are the leaders for the system? So these are the central office leaders. And all this is supported by an Office of Leadership Pipelines. So you can see how there's a pipeline, how leadership development occurs along the way. And you can also see this is integrated, and it creates the pipeline for when vacancies occur. And one can begin to match, the district can then match leader opportunities and vacancies with the talent that has been developed along the way. So in short, this district has focused leadership pipelines on talent management, knowledge management, and on the administrative context, knowing the system and the resources to make the system effective. I'm going to digress for 1 minute, because in our research on leadership pipelines, which we did started during the pandemic, one of the things that became very clear to us when we had to do interviews over Zoom was that the school leaders were all talking about moving towards a different set of standards beyond instructional leadership. And what those standards were these 5 foci. So maybe in your conversations this afternoon, especially after my colleagues talk, there can be some discussion about where we should be heading to successfully provide frameworks for developing leaders around resilience, problem solving, equity, well-being, and efficacy, and in our context, a lot of understanding around the politics of the role. So what is the evidence that we have around principal pipelines? So we have districts that are implementing this comprehensive approach. It took them many, many years, in some cases up to 5 years, to develop all of the domains and the steps in the pipeline. So we have 2 types of evidence. One is the impact, and the other is implementation. So when the Wallace Foundation first started to implement principal pipelines, one of their questions was, does this make a difference? If so, how? And then the second question is, can we scale up? Can we make this more widespread? So I'm going to share with you some of the evidence that we have, both about impact very quickly, that's not my work, and then implementation and scale up. So the initial implementation of principal pipelines were done in 6 large urban districts. And the study followed the districts for about 5 years that implemented principal pipelines, and they compared them to districts that were similar on size, student characteristics, superintendent leadership tenure, and they wanted to know whether there were changes in the principal pipeline districts compared to the other districts. And what they found very quickly was that pipeline schools with the newly appointed principals, so these are principals that had gone through the pipeline, right? They had development earlier on. They had new standards. They worked with preparation programs that were very embedded in the district context, all of those domains. So the principal pipeline, newly placed principals, outperformed in student achievement the comparison schools that did not go through a pipeline. They also found that in those districts with the pipeline, they had better principal retention compared to the schools that didn't have pipelines. Now, of course, across 6 districts, you're going to have variation. It's a lot of technical qualifications to these findings, but on average, this is the big headline. Pipelines seem to be able to work on the outcomes that we care about, retention and student achievement. 6 districts, it's not very many. And those 6 districts had an amazing amount of support, including financial resources, expertise. They were part of a learning community. They had a lot of attention, for many, many years. So the question is, could this be implemented, something so complex in other districts? And we know this is a challenge. All over the world, we have examples of interventions, policies, programs that have amazing results in partnership with districts, but they're on a very small scale. We talk a lot about research practice partnerships, but they're at a very small scale. So the Wallace Foundation wanted to know, can they at least be implemented, something so big and complex? So my team has been studying this for the past 4 years almost, where the Wallace Foundation recruited 84 districts. Now, these districts volunteered, and they did not receive any financial resources. So this is a model that we call, in the Wallace Foundation, we have termed accelerated scale-up or accelerated take-up. So we have been studying these districts. Now, what's the accelerated take-up or scale-up model? So the accelerated scale-up model is the following supports: 84 districts and a learning community. Each district created a team of central office leaders from 3 to 5. So one support is the districts all did a self-study. I'm happy to share these resources. A self-study is, where are we currently along the domains, the 7 domains? Do we have differentiated standards? Do we have support? Do we have leadership opportunities early on? It's very detailed. The self-study created community in the district because most people said, well, I don't know. They had to go find evidence to determine where they were. After the self-study, each district chose one area that they wanted to focus on, what is called an early win. You know, in the change process, if something's going to take 5 years until you're finished implementing, you're going to lose your folks, right? It's like a bad football game. You know, after a while, people lose interest. So an early win was, what do we think we can accomplish within 3 to 6 months? The learning community came together about every 3 to 4 months. It was all on Zoom because this was during the pandemic. And they started sharing their work on developing their pipelines in their domains. The only resource the foundation gave them was a consultant. So an experienced mentor, coach, prior leader who helped them interpret their data, navigate the politics, put together a very detailed work plan of how they will develop and implement their pipeline in 5 years. So the consultant was available to consult. The consultant shared a lot of knowledge, resources, Wallace especially, but the consultants had access to tools, to what other districts were doing, and research that they brought into the district to help them determine the pathway they were going to take. And then there were also smaller regional and state networks, so they could talk to people who were in the same communities as them. So this was the model: 84 districts, no money, just these supports. There were a number of reasons that districts determined they wanted to do pipelines, including building a bench, developing quality, increasing retention, growing their own. So the motivation for doing pipelines from our research aligned with the purpose. And here we see some data on how they were able to implement the pipeline. And of course, as you would expect with 84 districts, that there would be a lot of variability. So some things these are the domains, 7 domains. There are core components, they're the anchors of what it is we're trying to achieve. So some districts could achieve quicker, and this was done about the 2nd and 3rd year, and other districts, of course, were still developing and planning. But what we see here is that training in PD domains, the things that they were already doing were easy to implement. The things that required a lot of coordination and new ways of working within the district were somewhat harder or slower to become operable within the time frame. And then the domains that were complex, such as new data systems that required new expertise and new ways of thinking, or things that interacted with the larger policy system, also were slower to take up. So you can see the distribution here where the green is fully operational and the black is they have not started at this time. What a second finding. So finding number 1, the purposes of the districts seem to align with the purpose of the initiative. Finding number 2, districts are implementing and able to implement at different levels. And finding number 3, networks were key. And the networks were important because it is through the networks actually that the pipelines can happen. And so we learned about the importance of helping individuals see themselves in career opportunities, anticipating change, and knowing what's happened as the change unfolds. So I mentioned to you that pipelines are a national perspective to leadership across the United States. So we went from 6 districts to 84 districts, and recently, lucky, there was a national survey that the RAND Corporation conducted that asked districts, to what extent are you implementing principal pipelines? And to what extent are you doing domains? So this is across the United States now. This is nationally representative data. And you can see that all districts are, once again, providing on-the-job support. That seems to be the easiest. And the data system seems to be the least implemented. But you can see how from a 6-district small implementation project, a phenomena, an idea, has quite large spread traction across the United States, mostly in large districts, less in median districts, and small districts. It's a whole different context, and happy to talk about that in the questions. So lastly, what explains district implementation? And we see here that districts who have strong leadership at the top are most likely to engage. Districts that have a clear pipeline leader who owns the initiative is very important, and that a viable team to create the necessary conditions within the district. So leadership really matters for any initiative, but especially for this initiative, because the district politics and context of change is so complicated. People were in silos, and this initiative requires unbreaking the silos. So lastly, I leave with you, what are the core components of pipelines that may work in your system, in your schools, and in your country? We have 7 domains. they may not be the right domains. But when we think about implementation, we think about what are the core components, what are then the organizational components that support the change, and then what are the context. And in our place, the organizational components explain whether pipelines could be successful or not. I think this sums up one of our participants said, we envision a leadership pipeline as something where pretty much everyone within the organization sees the through line to leadership. And if we can achieve that and consider the future schools and the future directions of the needs of our children and our students, I think we will make a big impact on changing education for the next generation. So I leave you with these recommendations, and I thank you very much. My pleasure. Yes. Okay. So I will stay here.
Gracias. Muy bien, damos las gracias a la profesora Ellen Goldring por compartir con nosotros esta valiosa presentación. A continuación, entonces, tenemos un espacio para que la profesora Goldring responda algunas de las preguntas que ustedes nos hicieron llegar. Hay un micrófono para poder pasarles a aquellos que hagan las preguntas, o tú las vas a hacer, ¿sí?
Bueno, hola a todos. Durante la presentación de la profesora Ellen Goldring recibimos algunas preguntas vía QR. Todos ustedes en sus bolsas que recibieron de acreditación deberían tener un código QR adentro que lo van a poder escanear durante las próximas presentaciones, por si acaso para recordarles a los que no lo hicieron. Y ahí van a poder hacer llegar las preguntas. Nosotros por tiempo vamos a seleccionar, y en este caso tuvimos que seleccionar solo algunas, pero estamos felices de recibir sus inquietudes para hacerlas llegar a nuestros expositores. Y en este caso tengo algunas como que llegaron durante la presentación de la profesora Goldring. Una dice acá que es de Juan, de la educación pública, y dice que actualmente en Chile se está discutiendo un proyecto de carrera directiva porque existe una carrera docente desde el 2016, pero no para directivos. Entonces, en su experiencia, ¿qué elementos son fundamentales de incorporar en la propuesta para atraer a docentes que postulen a cargos directivos?
Thank you so much for your question. Again, I don't know, unfortunately, enough about your context, so I need to be, careful about what I think. But I think what is important is to include the voices of teachers and ask them to consider what would be attractive for them to move into leadership positions. And I think there's always two things to consider. One we call the extrinsic motivators, such as pay, work-life balance. But I think a lot of it has to do with how schools are organized inside. The principal role has almost become impossible. It's too much for any one person. So I think it's an opportunity to consider what's the leadership team, what's the differentiating staffing that could make all of the leadership positions more motivating and impactful. Thank you.
Tenemos tiempo para, lamentablemente, una pregunta más, yo creo, por tiempo. Y acá dice, no tiene nombre esta pregunta, pero nos llegó y dice, ¿cómo determinar el perfil de los directores de acuerdo a las culturas de cada distrito? Bueno, en nuestro contexto local, a cada servicio local, cada municipalidad, me imagino. ¿El perfil se determina de acuerdo a las competencias?
Yes, so we also have pipelines are really determined by each district. So the competencies, yes, are very much aligned to local context. I think that's very important. But I also think, as you're going to hear in the next presentation, there's actually a very strong evidence base about what successful principals actually do and what their roles are. So I think it's a combination of taking those specific roles, tasks, and understandings, but they have to be embedded within the local community, and that varies greatly. And lastly, thinking about where we're headed as a future. I think the future of work is greatly going to change, and we have to think about what that means for professions in education. Thank you very much.